Hello and welcome to our introductory discussion of the lesson on the American Revolution. The first lesson in our module on revolutions. We're going to deal with a series of revolutions over the next few weeks.
Yeah.
We're going to look at the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, significant stories in the history of the Atlantic world. And
Not the only revolutions, but significant ones.
certainly the ones I think that get the most attention.
Absolutely.
In the broader historiography for sure. American Revolution, 1775 ends in 1783 with ultimately the defeat of the British Empire, the 13 American colonies defeating in a major war that nobody really expected them to win, but they do win.
It's a David and Goliath story
Absolutely,
in some ways.
absolutely, very much so. It's one that one hesitates to call it mythic, but in many ways it is a mythic history. It's a story that within the United States has a powerful hold on people's self-conceptions. There's a lot of misconceptions about the story. We'll deal with a little bit of that this week, not a whole lot, but some of it.
So when you say mythic, you're not talking about this elements that are inherent in the story, but they have become part of a story that generations of historians have told, particularly in the United States.
That's a particular way of telling the story.
Right.
And so one of those things, and we'll pick this up later in our discussion, but one of those things is an awful lot of people sort of believe that the American Revolution kind of invents democracy. And we know that's not the case. We saw this with the Diggers in our own readings.
And the Levelers, yes.
And the Levelers. British parliamentary democracy, limited democracy, but it's existed for hundreds of years.
And the idea of democracy itself is ancient.
Absolutely, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
People often point to the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, as forming a democratic society as well. So there's all kinds of other examples out there.
Mm-hmm.
So a little quick bit of background here, and I think that will help put that into context.
Yeah.
Much of the story of the American Revolution dates back to our earlier conversation on the 7 Years' War. And of course,
Yes.
the outcome of the 7 Years' War is France defeated, forced to remove themselves from North America. And it really points to a major success for the British Empire. They are suddenly they control the North Atlantic Ocean in a way that they had never done before.
Yeah.
And they dominate the North American continent in a way that they hadn't done before.
Okay, yes.
But what really emerges from that is a recognition, particularly on the part of American colonists, that they view the world differently than their British masters. Remember, these people in the 7 Years' War view themselves as Britons. They don't view themselves as Americans. They view themselves as Britons, fighting for Britain in the overseas empire. But they begin to see differences in how that story, what the meaning of that story was. So, for example, 7 Years' War costs a lot of money. The British have to start imposing taxes to pay for that war.
Mm-hmm.
They try to impose them on the American colonies.
Yeah.
Raise a lot of money. A lot of resentment comes from this. That famous phrase, no taxation without representation, comes from this. And the Americans are angered that their autonomy, the autonomy that they've held for, well, depending on the colony, for 100, 150 years, has been shattered in this moment. They believe that they have a right to impose taxation on themselves, and nobody else has that right, because they don't get representation in the British Parliament. So, they're ruling themselves through their own governments, through their own assemblies, and so on.
So this strains the relationship then between the colonists in the Americas and the British monarchy headed by the king, and also coordinating with Parliament in
reality, the
London.
king has no real role here by this point in time. Parliament is doing almost everything, but still,
yes,
in terms of how we understand that, it's the king.
And that's how Americans
portray that story.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so a revolt in part against monarchy.
And in fact, next week, of course, we'll see a revolt against their own monarchy in the French Revolution. They'll cut off his head. The Americans don't get to do that. But there will be that. But symbolically, it's certainly happening at the same time. The other thing, we can quickly point to this, and it is contextual, but it still matters. The other point upon which Americans see the different interests is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. At the end of the 7 Years' War, we saw that map last week. They draw that line up the Appalachian.
Several lessons ago, just because, don't forget the workshops.
Oh, I forgot about the workshops.
Don't forget the workshops.
In our last lesson, we saw that map on the line drawn up the Appalachian Mountains. And what the British were doing there was declaring all that territory to the west Indian territory. And by doing so, they were cutting off Americans from settling there. Americans thought they had fought that war precisely to gain access to that territory. And here was the British government saying, no, you can't go there. So again, a distinct idea of different interests at play there. They realize that the British think of their interests differently than they do. And so that's part of that conflict. So that's kind of a basic bit of background for thinking about that story. Cutting in on their autonomy, cutting in on their freedom, jeopardizing and putting that kind of heavy-handed imperial hand down on forcing the colonists to behave in a particular fashion, and recognizing a changing set of interests involved with these people.
So we have a kind of twofold exploration of the themes of the American Revolution in this lesson, and we've talked in part about already in our discussion so far the nature of the revolt. It's a revolt in part against British overlordship, the British monarchy, the rule of the heavy-handed nature of parliamentary British taxation on American colonists who consider themselves British, but not under who shouldn't be under the thumb of their British cousins.
Early in the debate on the revolution, before the revolution actually begins, but when they're talking about their complaints, they speak of themselves as freeborn Britishmen. That's their self-conception. Their freedom, their Britishness is part of their freedom. Ironically, that'll get turned on its head very shortly, but that's how they think about it.
And we understand this perhaps in relationship to earlier lessons in which British men and women, levelers and diggers, are thinking about their own freedom against the English monarchs in the 17th century, a century earlier.
Yeah.
So there's a tradition of subjects thinking of themselves as free men in relationship to their British rulers that goes back a long way.
And next week we can play, and this week as well, we can think a little bit about what that men means. Because of course it's a limit on who gets to be free.
So not just the nature of the revolt in that it's a revolt against the monarchy and a distant set of brothers and sisters in the homeland of England, but this is a revolution that has some deep ideals. Ideals about freedom of taxation.
All men are created equal. That's powerful phrase.
That's an ideal that will have echoes today. Yeah. Certainly it echoes in all of the subjects that we're going to encounter in the rest of the lessons in this module and in the course.
It's impossible to think about the abolition movement unless you have a notion of all men are created equal.
Now, so that all men are created equal, but what does that mean? The question that you posed, Danny. Do men include women?
Yes.
That's an obvious question, right? But it was a profound and heavy one for the revolutionaries themselves.
Some of them didn't really entertain it too long.
But they had to, because it was forced upon them by
women.
By women and by other men as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what about the slaves that American colonists relied on so heavily in many places to
from cleaning their houses to working their fields.
Yes. Yeah. So we're
and as Michelle Obama mentioned recently, from building the White House.
Yes. So are slaves men who have freedom as well? We know clearly what the answer should be from our moral and ethical point of view, but this was a profoundly troubling question for those people who thought about it, and not everyone did, again. We're going to run across this question in the coming weeks as well.
Yes.
And then, well, what about indigenous people?
Well, again, another limit. So you've mentioned that there's an ideal of democracy here, there's an ideal of equality here, but there are real limits here. Women do not get this equality. African American slaves in particular. Freeborn blacks will get some of it. Dodge your question. But indigenous people won't be subject to it as well. So there's a real line being drawn. These people get freedom, these people don't get freedom. And how they make that calculation, how they understand that general position will be instrumental in the rest of American history. Think of the American Civil War. Think of all the things that are going to emerge from that failure to actually bring these people into that larger democratic project. This is a basic story, a very, very important story.
So we already have the outlines of a big question for this week, but how can we frame that big question in a clear way for everyone?
Well, the simplest way to think about the big question is how did these people understand freedom?
Whoever they were, so we have to pay attention to who.
No, absolutely, but we've got this kind of, just begin with a kind of mythic notion of the American revolutionary people, the colonists, the revolutionaries. Right. How did they understand freedom? And what we'll see from our readings this week is that they have very different ideas about it. Even people that you can put in that kind of clear revolutionary camp, some of them want to bring the slaves in, some of them don't. Some of them want to extend it to indigenous people, some of them don't. Most of them don't, and that's why there's eventually a consensus around, no, it's just about men,
Right.
it's just about white men. But there is a debate, there is discussion, there's certainly an understanding that there's a problem at work there.
Yeah.
So that basic question of what freedom meant to these people, what did freedom mean to these people, to these revolutionary
Yeah.
people? And then secondarily, what then prompted them to rebel? What then prompted them to actually, and this is an important consideration, it's something I talk about a lot in the Canadian context in other courses, for example, in the 1837 rebellions. What prompts you to put a musket to your shoulder and shoot at another man?
Who might be a relative.
Might be a cousin, might be a neighbor, might be a German mercenary soldier brought in by the king, but you're still going to kill another man over a political principle, and that's a profound question.
Okay, so there's two approaches for this week,
Yes.
right? In terms of looking at sources.
Yes.
And so what's everyone going to be working with in a practical way?
Okay, so we've been doing things, reading different sets of sources, primary sources, different sets of secondary sources in different weeks. This week we've got two completely separate groups of readings, depending on whether you're in Group A or Group B. And the people in Group A will be reading sources on the kind of basic questions of freedom, documents that discuss freedom, discuss democracy, discuss the differences with Great Britain, discuss the causes of the revolution in some fashion. And they have a secondary reading by an historian, Gordon Wood, who's probably one of the best-known American writers on the American Revolution, very famous writer.
Yeah.
And he broadly outlines for us that basic question of freedom and what freedom means and how it led to the revolution. And then we have, in Group B, another set of readings that look at the limits, that look at how women, and African Americans in particular, are both trying to find their way into that camp of the people that get freedom and other people rejecting it, how that debate is playing out on the ground. So what we really want to see is both the ideal, but also the limits to the ideal. So different people reading one set of documents, different people reading another set of documents, and then we want you to have a conversation.
Yeah.
You read these documents, you learn things, you develop an understanding of that. Have a conversation with each other.
Both in the groups, the individual groups?
Within individual groups, but also across the groups.
Yeah.
Those of you who read Wood and the freedom documents, talk to the people who are reading Pybus and the race and gender documents. Talk about answering that basic question.
From a different set of
From
perspectives.
a different set of perspectives. What did freedom mean? What prompted these people to rebel?
Okay.
And we can arrive at some interesting discussions that way, I think.
Okay. So thinking in terms of the toolbox skills, we are coming back to some of the fundamental skills of historical and historiographical thinking that we've asked everyone to practice from week to week so far. As always, one of the fundamental skills that any student of history, whether a professor or an undergraduate student, has to practice and has to pay attention to is the analysis of sources, both primary and secondary sources. And along with the close and careful attention to those sources comes a variety of other kinds of skills. So looking at bias and perspective, or the significance of the sources in relationship to one another. In the workshops, we've introduced everyone to concepts and the analysis of concepts briefly, but this is a week in which everyone can analyze concepts in the documents, because we've got some very famous concepts. Liberty is one of those very famous concepts. So that's
and a critical one for us going forward in this course.
Yes. So this is a further exercise in close reading, but you can apply some of the lessons from the workshop weeks on distant reading to this particular lesson. And also in relationship, just briefly, to sources. In a previous lesson, we've outlined briefly some of the important standards for citation of sources. And this is one of the challenges, I think, for a lot of students. What's the proper way to write a footnote or a bibliographical entry? The reason that it's so important to write, to compose a good footnote entry or a bibliographic entry is because it helps explain to other people and to yourself when you go back over essays where you
got that information,
what sources you were using. So because sources are so important, citation is important. And we're going to be outlining that again for everyone just because it's a good thing to practice against.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll have a little more detail there in the Sakai, the scalar introduction there.
Yes. So I think that's certainly enough to work with for this week.
That's plenty. Big topic, big concepts, lots of stuff to work with.
I don't think we've had a small topic for the course so far, but
it's a big course.
Yes. Okay.
Enjoy.